The moment Helen Ramsey stepped off the westbound stage in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, 3 different men warned her about Lionel Blackwell before her boots had even touched the dust of the main street. She had traveled 4 days from St. Louis with 2 children pressed against her sides, her daughter Clara, who was 7 years old and had her late father's serious brown eyes, and her son Thomas, who was 5 and had not stopped asking questions about cowboys since they crossed the Missouri border. Helen carried a single trunk, a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, and the kind of quiet determination that only forms in a woman who has survived grief and come out the other side still standing. The stagecoach driver, a heavy-set man named Polk who smelled of tobacco and horse sweat, had tipped his hat and said, without any invitation to do so, "You heading to the Ramsey claim out on the South Fork? Word is old Dan Ramsey left that land to his kin. If it's you, then I'd watch yourself around the man who's been working that land." Helen had straightened her back. "I am Helen Ramsey. The land belonged to my late husband's uncle, and it now belongs to me and my children by legal inheritance. Who exactly should I be watching myself around?" Polk had scratched his jaw and looked sideways at the 2 men who had climbed down from the stage ahead of her. "Lionel Blackwell. He's been running cattle across that south pasture for going on 2 years. He ain't going to be happy about a widow and 2 small ones showing up with a deed." One of the other men, a traveling dry goods merchant named Aldridge, had nodded gravely and added, "Blackwell's rough, missus. He was a scout before he turned to ranching, fought on the frontier campaigns. They say he has no church, no God, and no patience for anything that gets in the way of his work." The third warning had come from the postmaster's wife, a thin woman named Mrs. Carver, who had spotted Helen walking past the post office window and come outside specifically to deliver it. She had pressed Helen's hands between her own dry palms and looked at her with the solemnity of a woman delivering a eulogy. "Honey, that man drinks alone, he fights alone, and he answers to nobody. You go out there to that land with those babies and you tell him to move his cattle, and there is no telling what he'll do. We have a boarding house right here on 2nd Street. You could stay." Helen had thanked her, collected her children, arranged for her trunk to be delivered, hired a wagon from the livery, and driven herself out to the South Fork. She was 30 years old. She had buried a husband, survived a Missouri winter on near nothing, and raised 2 children through the worst of it. She was not afraid of a rough man. She told herself that the whole drive out. The land opened up past the edge of town in a way that made her breath catch despite herself. The Kansas plains in late April were something she had not expected. The grass was high and green from spring rains, rolling in slow waves under a wide sky that seemed to go on forever in every direction. Wildflowers pushed up through the grass in patches of yellow and purple. A creek line wound through the low ground, marked by a ribbon of cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out. Beyond the trees, she could see the roofline of a modest house and the dark shapes of cattle spread across a long slope of pasture. Thomas had climbed up onto the wagon seat beside her and was gripping the side rail with both hands. "Mama, is that our land?" "Some of it," she said. "The house and the east pasture and the creek bottom." "All of it as far as that ridge?" "It's big," Clara said from behind them, standing up carefully in the wagon bed and shading her eyes. "It is big," Helen agreed. "It is going to take all of us to work it." She did not let them see that her hands were tight on the reins. She pulled the wagon up to the fence line and had barely climbed down when she saw him. Lionel Blackwell came out from behind the barn with a length of fence wire in one gloved hand and a look on his face that was not quite a scowl, but was not far from one. He was taller than she had expected from the way people talked about him, as if roughness was a small thing. He was broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, wearing a canvas work coat darkened with sweat and dust. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that she noticed even from 20 feet away because they were sharp and direct in a way that made her want to look somewhere else. She did not look somewhere else. He stopped when he saw her. His gaze moved from her to Clara to Thomas and then back to her, and something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of recalibration, as if he had been expecting something else and was now having to adjust his thinking. "You're on posted land," he said. His voice was low and flat, the kind of voice that did not raise itself to make a point. "I am on my land," Helen said. She pulled the deed from her coat pocket and held it out. "I am Helen Ramsey. Daniel Ramsey was my husband's uncle, and he left this property to my family in his will. I have the deed from the county recorder's office in Caldwell, and I have a letter from his attorney in Wichita." Lionel Blackwell looked at the paper she held out. He did not take it. He looked at it from where he stood, and then he looked at her again with those gray-green eyes, and she had the distinct feeling of being assessed, the way a man assesses weather or terrain. "Dan Ramsey's been dead 8 months, he said. "I am aware. His attorney's letter took 2 months to reach me in St. Louis, and I have spent the months since arranging my affairs and traveling here. I am aware that is a long time. I am here now." A long pause stretched between them. Somewhere out on the pasture one of his cattle bawled, a long, carrying sound. "I have 300 head of cattle on that south pasture," he said. "Then you will need to move them," she said. "I am not asking you to do it tonight. I understand you will need time to make arrangements. But this is my land and my children's land, and I intend to live on it and work it." Thomas, who had been wide-eyed and silent through all of this, chose that moment to climb down from the wagon and walk directly toward Lionel Blackwell with the absolute fearlessness that belongs only to 5-year-old boys and the very old. He stopped about 3 feet from the man and looked up at him. "Are you a cowboy?" Thomas asked. Something moved across Lionel Blackwell's face then, a flicker, quick and gone, but Helen caught it. It was something between surprise and something else she could not name. "I ranch cattle," he said to the boy. "That is the same thing," Thomas said with complete confidence. Another flicker. This one Helen thought might have been the ghost of a smile. "Thomas," Helen said evenly, "come back to the wagon." The boy came back, but he kept looking over his shoulder at the tall man with the fence wire in his hand. Lionel Blackwell looked at Helen again. "House needs work," he said. "I have been using the north room as a storage room. I can clear it by tomorrow." She blinked. She had not expected that. She had expected an argument, a challenge, possibly a refusal. She had not expected practical accommodation. "That is appreciated," she said carefully. "Water pump in the kitchen still works. I will check the roof before the week is out." He said it like a list, like a man going through obligations, not like a man making an offer of kindness. But it was one, and they both knew it. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and Helen stood in the spring afternoon with her 2 children and her deed and the strange, quiet feeling that she had just been assessed and not been found wanting. She went into the house. It was rough, she would not pretend otherwise. The walls needed whitewashing and the floors needed scrubbing, and the kitchen was a disaster of old tins and wooden crates, but the bones of it were sound. The windows had glass. The chimney drew. There was a woodpile out back that was stacked with the precision of a man who did not waste effort. She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. By the time the light was going gold out the western window, she had the kitchen cleared and the stove lit, and a pot of salt pork and dried beans on the heat. Clara had swept the main room, and Thomas had carried water from the pump until his arms were shaking with the effort, proud of every trip. She heard boots on the porch and felt herself go still for a moment before she called, "Come in a voice that she kept perfectly level. Lionel Blackwell stood in the doorway holding 2 things, a jar of preserved peaches and a look on his face that suggested he was not entirely sure why he was standing there with a jar of preserved peaches. "From last fall," he said. "There is more in the cellar. Dan put them up. You should have them." Clara had appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and was watching him with those serious brown eyes. "Thank you," Helen said. She took the jar. Their fingers did not quite touch, but it was close. He looked around the kitchen. She watched him notice what she had done in just a few hours, the order she had brought, the fire, the smell of food cooking. "There is a loose board on the second porch step," he said, and it sounded like an apology for something, though she could not have said what. "I noticed it," she said. "I will fix it tomorrow." "I can fix it," he said. "I am sure you have your own work," she said. "I do," he agreed. And then he left, and she listened to the sound of his boots on the porch, avoiding the loose board on the second step. And she stood there for a moment with the jar of peaches in her hands and something strange and warm happening in her chest that she firmly told herself was only relief at finding the situation less hostile than expected. She was wrong about that, but she would not know it for a while yet. The first 2 weeks were a careful dance of adjacent existences. Lionel Blackwell's cattle were on the south pasture, which bordered her land, and he himself came and went from the barn and the creek without interference. He was working his own land to the west of hers, and he kept to it mostly. But she would see him sometimes riding the fence line in the early morning, or working at the watering trough in the late afternoon, always with that same quality of contained, purposeful motion that she found herself watching when she thought she could do so without being noticed. He had fixed the porch step the morning after he had mentioned it, before she was even fully awake. She had come out in the gray morning light and found it done. The new board fitted flush and solid, and had stood there with her shawl around her shoulders, feeling something that she would only later recognize as the beginning of trust. He brought the preserved peaches back twice more from the cellar, along with a sack of cornmeal and some dried apples, all things that had been Daniel Ramsey's but that she had legal claim to. Each time he delivered them with the same flat efficiency, as if kindness were a transaction to be completed quickly and without ceremony. Each time she thanked him with equal efficiency and watched him go. Thomas was developing what could only be described as a case of devoted admiration. He had taken to appearing near wherever Lionel Blackwell was working, not interfering, just appearing, the way small boys do, and watching with enormous eyes. Lionel, for his part, had not told the boy to go away, which Helen considered significant. The first real conversation happened on a Tuesday morning when she was mending the fence on the east pasture line, and he was riding back from the creek and stopped his horse, a gray gelding, with a patient, heavy-headed manner, and looked at what she was doing. "You know how to work wire fence," he said. "I know how to learn," she said, without looking up from the splice she was attempting. There was a pause. Then he dismounted, looped his reins over the fence post, came over and without a word, took the wire from her hands and showed her how the splice was done. He stood close to her to do it, and she could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning air, and she was very careful to watch only his hands and the wire. "Like this," he said. "I see," she said. He handed it back and stepped away and watched her do it. She did it correctly. Something in his expression shifted again, that same quality of reassessment. "Where is your husband?" he asked, not unkindly, just directly. "He died of fever 2 years ago," she said. "In St. Louis. He was a printer." A pause. "I am sorry. Thank you." She moved to the next post and started on the next splice. "What about you? Is there a Mrs. Blackwell somewhere?" "No," he said. Flat and final, and carrying something heavy inside it that she did not press. "I see," she said again. He watched her work for another moment and then picked up his reins and rode on. That was how it started. The conversations came gradually, like water finding its way through rock, not by force but by persistence and time. She would be working in the kitchen garden she was putting in behind the house, and he would pass by on his way to the creek, and he would stop for a moment. Just a moment. And they would exchange a few words about the weather, about the land, about the state of the creek level, about the cattle she was beginning to think about acquiring of her own to work the pasture. She found, in those spare exchanges, that Lionel Blackwell was a man who listened with the whole of his attention when someone was speaking, and who said nothing that he did not mean, and who never once spoke to her as though her widowhood or her femininity meant she was incapable of understanding anything he said. She found that she looked forward to those moments in the way she once looked forward to letters from her mother, as small, precious, specific things. Clara remained measured in her observations, watching Lionel Blackwell with those careful brown eyes without giving much away. She was a child who had grown old before her time, the way children do when they lose a parent young, and she had installed in herself a quiet caution that Helen both admired and ached over. Thomas had by the end of the third week simply begun to follow Lionel Blackwell the way a duckling follows water. She had come out of the house one afternoon to find Thomas sitting on the top rail of the barn fence while Lionel worked below him, and the two of them were talking, or rather, Thomas was talking, at considerable length, about whether horses preferred oats or corn, and Lionel was answering each question with the same careful seriousness he gave to everything. Helen stood at the corner of the house and watched for a moment without them seeing her. She put her hand over her mouth. She would not cry. She was not going to cry over a man she barely knew being patient with her son. She went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a full minute before she got up and went back to work. At the end of the third week, the difficulty with the Hollies brothers arrived. There were three of them, Cade, Roy, and Burl Hollies, and they had been running cattle on unfenced land north of town, and had developed the habit of letting those cattle drift south, which meant they frequently ended up on Helen's east pasture, eating her grass and breaking her fence line. The first time it happened, she had ridden to their place to speak to them directly. Cade Hollies, the eldest, was a large man with the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes, and he had looked at her from his porch with something that was not quite contempt but was close enough to be insulting, and had said that cattle will wander, and there was not much to be done about it. She had come home and repaired the fence herself. The second time it happened, she had gone back and been less polite, and Cade Hollies had been less pleasant, and she had ridden home with her jaw tight and her stomach hard and written out a formal notice of trespass to leave with the county sheriff. She had not yet gone to the sheriff when she came out one morning and found 12 Hollies cattle in her east pasture, and 2 lengths of her fence pulled down, not broken, not knocked over by animals, but pulled down deliberately, wire cut and posts yanked from the ground. She was standing there looking at it when Lionel Blackwell rode up. She did not have to say anything. He looked at the cut wire and the pulled posts and his jaw went tight. "The Hollies brothers," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am going to the sheriff today," she said. He dismounted. "I will come with you." She turned to look at him. "You do not need to do that." He looked back at her. The morning light was flat and clear, and it lit his face in a way that showed all the lines of it, the weathered set of his eyes and the hard line of his mouth, and something underneath both of those things that was simpler and more direct. "I know I do not need to," he said. "I am coming anyway." Sheriff Dave Alderman was a competent man who had held the position long enough to know when a situation would escalate and when it would not. He listened to Helen's account with attention and looked at Lionel Blackwell's presence beside her as a piece of information rather than an intrusion. "Cade Hollies is going to say the fence was poorly built and the cattle just got through," he said. "The wire was cut," Helen said. "You can see it yourself." "I have no doubt," Alderman said. "I will ride out to the Hollies' place this afternoon and have a conversation." He looked at Lionel. "You are Blackwell." "Yes," Lionel said. "I know your reputation," Alderman said. There was no judgment in it, just the same quality of directness. "If this situation is going to stay handled through official channels, I need it to stay there. I do not need vigilante resolution." "It will stay there," Lionel said. Alderman nodded slowly. "All right, I will handle the Hollies matter. You two go back to your land." They rode back mostly in silence, which was a kind of silence Helen was getting used to. It was never empty with him, never uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who were thinking about the same things, without needing to make noise about it. When they reached the fence line, Lionel stopped his horse and looked at the pulled posts and said, "I will help you repair this." "I will not argue about it," she said. They worked together for 3 hours in the morning sun, setting new posts and restringing wire. Thomas appeared and was given the important job of holding the wire taut between posts, which he did with the fierce concentration of a boy who understands that he is doing a real thing. Clara brought water out to them at midday, walking carefully across the grass with the bucket, and she handed it first to Lionel, who thanked her solemnly, and then to her mother. Helen watched her daughter hand that bucket to that man, and watched him take it with both hands and drink and nod at Clara with the same respect he would give an adult, and she felt the thing in her chest do something she had been trying to keep it from doing. She turned back to the fence post and worked very hard at it. That evening, after supper, when she was washing up and the children were in the main room, and she could hear the sound of Thomas describing his fence-fixing accomplishments in considerable detail to Clara, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun go down over the western pasture in a blaze of orange and deep red, and she thought about Lionel Blackwell. She thought about the way he had stood beside her in the sheriff's office without making her feel small or saved. She thought about his hands on the fence wire and the way he had shown her the splice without condescension. She thought about the jar of preserved peaches. She thought about the porch step. She thought, I am in a great deal of trouble. She was not wrong. There was a church in Caldwell, a small white building on the edge of town, with a young minister named Reverend Josiah Wells who preached on Sundays and ran a Sunday school on Wednesday afternoons. Helen had been taking the children on Sundays since their second week there, and she had begun to notice, with a feeling she could not fully name, that Lionel Blackwell was never among the congregation. She had not asked him about it. It was not her business. But Mrs. Carver, who had been warning her about Lionel Blackwell since the moment she arrived, and who clearly took some satisfaction in having her warnings go unheeded, had mentioned it again one Sunday afternoon. He has not set foot in a church since 1873, Mrs. Carver said, with the relish of a woman delivering confirmed intelligence. After his wife died, Helen went still. He had a wife, Ada Blackwell. She died in childbirth. The baby, too. Mrs. Carver pressed her lips together. He was already rough before that. After, they say, he closed off completely, gave up whatever faith he might have had and never looked back. Helen said nothing. She drove home thinking about a man who had lost what she had lost, and then one thing more, the cruelest thing, and had carried it alone on a prairie for 5 years. She did not bring it up to him. But she thought about it in the quiet hours after the children were asleep, and she thought about it with a tenderness that surprised her with its intensity. The shift came on a Friday evening in late May. The day had been hard. A heifer had gotten into the kitchen garden and destroyed 2 rows of beans and the better part of the herb bed, and she had spent 2 hours chasing the animal back to the pasture, and another 2 hours surveying the damage with a heavy heart, because those beans were to have been their primary summer food source. She was sitting on the front porch steps in the evening, the repaired second step, solid underfoot, with her face in her hands and her shoulders bowed, not crying, just very tired in the way that is different from physical tiredness, when she heard horse hooves and looked up. Lionel Blackwell had been riding back from the south pasture and had apparently seen her from the road. He stopped his horse at the fence gate and looked at her. "What happened?" he said. She told him about the heifer and the garden. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post and walked up to the porch and sat down on the steps beside her. He did not say it would be fine. He did not say she could replant. He did not offer solutions or minimizing words. He just sat down beside her in the evening light and was there. After a while she said, "I am sorry." "You do not need to sit with a woman feeling sorry for herself." "You are not feeling sorry for yourself," he said. "You are tired." The accuracy of it hit her somewhere in the center of her chest. "Yes," she said. "You have done a remarkable amount with this place," he said, and it was said with the same flat honesty he applied to everything, which made it worth more than any amount of elaborate praise. "In 2 months." She looked at him. He was looking out over the pasture, his arms resting on his knees. "Thank you," she said. "That is thank you." He turned and looked at her then directly, and for a moment neither of them looked away, and she felt the full weight of that gray-green gaze and what was inside it, which was something she had been half aware of for weeks and had been carefully not looking at directly. She looked away first. She looked at the sky. "Mrs. Carver told me about your wife," she said quietly. It was possibly the most audacious thing she had said to him. She held very still, waiting for his response. A long pause. The evening birds were loud in the cottonwoods. "She had no business doing that," he said. His voice was flat, but there was a current running under it. "No," Helen agreed. "She did not. I am sorry." "You do not have to speak about it." Another pause. And then, to her absolute surprise, he said, "Her name was Ada. We were married 4 years, and then nothing more, but it was more than she thought he would give, and she received it with the care it deserved. My husband's name was Robert," she said. "He was a good man, not a strong man, but a good one." She paused. "I think that is perhaps the most honest thing I have said about him since he died." Lionel looked at her sidelong. There was something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was warm in its way. They sat on the steps for another hour as the light left the sky, talking in the way they had not yet talked, not about fences and cattle and weather, but about other things. About what Kansas had looked like to him when he first rode through it. About what St. Louis had been like at its worst. About the things you miss when someone is gone, and about the things you do not miss, and about the long work of continuing. It was the first time she heard him laugh, just once briefly, at something she said about Thomas and his current conviction that he could tame a prairie dog colony. It was a low, rough sound, unused, like a door long closed and just now opening. She felt it all the way through. When she finally rose to go in and get supper on, she paused at the door and looked at him still sitting on the steps. "Thank you for sitting with me," she said. He nodded just once. He picked up his hat from the step beside him. "Lionel," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He went very still. "You are welcome at my table any time you want to be," she said. "For supper, if you want it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right," and he stood up and followed her into the house. After that, it became a thing that happened. Not every night, but several nights a week. He would come to supper, and he would sit at the kitchen table with Helen and Clara and Thomas, and he would listen to Thomas talk and answer Clara's careful questions with equal care, and he would help with the dishes afterward in a silence that felt, increasingly, less like restraint and more like contentment. Clara was the harder one to win, and Lionel seemed to understand this without being told. He never pushed her for warmth she wasn't offering. He answered her questions directly, treated her observations with respect, and once when she had been struggling with a spelling exercise from the school primer and had put it down in frustration, he had looked at it quietly and said, "The rule for that word is this," and had explained it clearly, and Clara had taken the primer back and tried it again and gotten it right and had looked at him with a new quality in her expression. Not trust yet, but the shape of a door. One night in early June after supper, Thomas had demanded a story, which was not unusual, and Helen had been clearing dishes and had missed the moment when Thomas turned to Lionel and said, with the absolute confidence of a boy who has identified his target, "Will you tell me a story?" She turned around with the pot in her hands. Lionel was looking at the boy. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had been handed something he did not know how to hold. Then he said, "What kind of story?" "A true one," Thomas said seriously, "from when you were on the frontier." Helen set the pot down slowly. Clara had looked up from her primer. And Lionel Blackwell told them a story. About a winter he had spent scouting along the Cimarron River, and about the particular beauty of a prairie sky in January, and about a night he had made camp alone and watched the stars for hours because there was nothing else to do and no sound anywhere in the world but the wind. He told it quietly and without embellishment, and it was the best story Helen had ever heard, not because of its drama, but because of the way it was told, like a man showing you something he had kept in his pocket for years. Thomas was asleep before it was finished, his head tipped over on the table. Clara was still awake, her chin in her hands, watching Lionel with those brown eyes, fully awake. Helen stood at the kitchen counter with her hands quiet and her heart doing something that was not quiet at all. When the story was done, Lionel looked at Thomas and then at Helen, and she came forward and picked the boy up. which was a considerable effort since he was not as small as he used to be, and carried him to the back room. When she came back, Lionel was still at the table and Clara was still awake, and they were not talking, but the silence had changed quality. It was softer now. "Time for bed, Clara," Helen said gently. Clara slid down from her chair and then, in a movement that was so quick and natural that it was clearly unrehearsed and instinctive, she paused beside Lionel and said, "Good night," and put her small hand briefly on his arm. Lionel looked at that small hand on his arm with an expression that Helen had to look away from because it was too private to watch straight on. He said, "Good night, Clara," in a voice that was not quite steady. Clara went to bed. Helen and Lionel sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low between them, and the house settling around them into its night sounds, and the prairie outside going dark and still. "She is a remarkable child," Lionel said. "She is," Helen agreed. "She has been carrying too much for too long. She was 5 when Robert died." "She trusted him," Lionel said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Helen traced a knot in the table with her finger. "She knows the difference." A long pause full of things neither of them said. "Helen," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at her directly, which he usually did, but there was something different in it tonight. The door, she thought. The door opening. "I am not a man who is easy to be around," he said. "I know that. I have been told it plainly enough." "You have been nothing but considerate to me and my children since we arrived," she said. "That is not the same as being easy," he said. "I have rough habits and poor manners in company, and I have not had patience for other people in a long time." He paused. "But I find that I have patience for you, that I have—" He stopped, started again. "That I think about you and the children most of the day." The honesty of it, the plainness of it, the way it cost him something to say it, and he said it anyway. Helen looked at the lamp. She looked at her hands. She looked at Lionel Blackwell, who was waiting with the careful stillness of a man who has said something true and now has to see what becomes of it. "I think about you too," she said. "More than is probably sensible given that we have known each other such a short time." 2 months, he said. 2 months, she agreed. "On a frontier, which I think ages time differently." The ghost of that smile again, the real one, the rare one. "It does." She reached across the table and placed her hand on top of his, just lightly. He looked down at it, and then he turned his hand over and closed it around hers, and they sat like that for a while with the lamp burning between them and the prairie dark outside the window. And it was the simplest and most overwhelming thing that had happened to Helen Ramsey since she stepped off that stagecoach. He rode home later that night, and she stood on the porch watching the gray gelding carry him through the gate, and she thought that the people who had warned her about Lionel Blackwell had known him by his surface and not by his depth, and she felt sorry for all of them, and glad, with a gladness that was almost painful, that she had not listened. The first time she saw him pray, she did not mean to see it. It was a week later, and the children had both had a hard day. Thomas had fallen and scraped his knee badly enough to bleed through 2 rags, and Clara had received a letter forwarded from St. Louis, a letter from her grandmother on Robert's side, and the letter had been cheerful and full of news, and had made Clara cry in the private, controlled way she cried, which was somehow more heartbreaking than any loud grief. Helen had put them to bed and come back to the kitchen and found Lionel still there. He had been at supper and had stayed while she tended Thomas's knee, fetching water and holding the boy still with a calm, steady hand. She had sent him back to the kitchen while she got the children to bed, and now she came back expecting to find him at the table. The kitchen was empty. She heard a low sound from the main room and stepped to the doorway. Lionel Blackwell was kneeling on the floor beside the doorway of the children's room. His head was bowed, and his voice was too low for her to make out the words fully, but she heard fragments, Thomas's name and Clara's, and words that were clearly the shape of supplication, asking for something from somewhere, for these 2 children asleep in the room beyond the door. She stood in the kitchen doorway and pressed her back against the doorframe and felt something enormous happen inside her. He had been told he had no faith. He had told himself that maybe. But here was Lionel Blackwell, the rough man, the godless man, on his knees in the dark of her main room asking God to watch over her children. She went back to the kitchen. She sat at the table. She pressed her hands flat on the wood. When he came back to the kitchen, she looked at him and he looked at her, and he seemed to understand immediately from her face that she had seen, and something in him went very quiet. She said, "How long have you been doing that?" He said, "Since about the third night I ate here," she said, "Lionel." And then, because there were no other adequate words, she stood up and crossed to him, and he held out his arms, and she walked into them, and he held her, solid and warm and real, in the middle of the kitchen in the lamplight on a Kansas spring night. She felt him breathe. She felt the careful, deliberate way his arms came around her, as if holding something he was afraid of dropping. She turned her face against his shoulder and closed her eyes. "I thought you had given up on God," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I thought so too," he said above her head. For a long time, a pause. "Your children make it hard to stay given up." She laughed, soft and broken. He held her more tightly. They stood like that for a while, and it was more intimate than anything she had known in years, this simple standing together, this shared warmth. When she finally stepped back, she looked up at his face and he looked down at hers, and it was clear that neither of them was going to pretend that this was anything other than what it was. "I want to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it." "I think we are somewhat past the formal beginning of courting," she said dryly. "Nonetheless," he said, and there was a firmness to it that she found she liked very much, "I want to do this right." "All right," she said, "court me properly then." He did. Courting, by Lionel Blackwell's standards, turned out to be a combination of intensely practical and achingly thoughtful. He came on Sunday afternoons and took the children to the creek to fish, which Thomas considered the finest arrangement in the world. He brought her a pouch of the good coffee from the mercantile, because he had noticed she stretched her own supply too thin. He rode with her into Caldwell twice to attend to business at the county recorder's and the bank, and when the bank clerk spoke to him instead of to her about her own account, Lionel had looked at the man with those gray-green eyes and said, with complete calm, "Mrs. Ramsey is the account holder. Direct your questions to her." And the clerk had reddened and done exactly that. She had wanted to take his hand right there in the bank, in front of the clerk and everyone. He also began attending Sunday services. She noticed him the first Sunday he came. He arrived late and took a seat in the back pew and sat through the whole of Reverend Wells' sermon with his hat in his hands and an expression that was not quite ease but was not resistance either. It was more like a man walking back into a house he had abandoned and finding that the bones of it were still sound. She had not said anything to him about it after, not wanting to make it a thing. But she had sat through the sermon herself that day, barely hearing a word of it, thinking about the man in the back pew. He was there the next Sunday, and the one after that. One Wednesday evening in late June, she was washing the supper dishes while Lionel sat at the kitchen table with Thomas on his knee and Clara at her elbow, and Thomas was explaining, at considerable length, a theological question that had arisen in Sunday school, specifically, whether there were horses in heaven, because if there were not, he was not sure the arrangement was fair. Lionel listened to the full argument with complete seriousness. "What do you think?" Thomas demanded. "I think," Lionel said carefully, "that if God made horses here, there is no reason he would not have thought of them elsewhere." Thomas seemed satisfied. "Clara says there is probably grass too," he offered. "Your sister is likely right," Lionel agreed, and Clara, at the dishpan beside her mother, smiled down at the water. It was the kind of smile Clara did not give away easily, and Helen saw it and felt it like sunshine. On the first Sunday in July, Reverend Wells preached a sermon about return, about the things we put down in grief, and the courage it takes to pick them back up. Helen was aware, without looking, that Lionel Blackwell was in the back pew, and she was aware that she was not the only one in the congregation who was aware of it, and she kept her eyes forward and her hands in her lap, and she listened to the sermon with her whole heart. Afterward, in the churchyard in the summer warmth, She found herself standing beside him while the children chased each other around the big elm at the edge of the lot. "Good sermon," he said. "Yes," she agreed. A pause. Then quietly, so that only she could hear, "I have been thinking about what Reverend Wells said last month, about the things that keep us from coming back." She looked at him. He was watching the children. "For me it was the feeling that I had been abandoned," he said. "After Ada, after the child," his jaw tightened, "that if there was a God, he had looked at what I wanted most and taken it from me deliberately." He paused. "It took me a long time to see it differently, to see that things happen that are not punishments." Helen said nothing for a moment. Then, "Robert's death felt like that to me for a while, like the ground had just given way and there was no reason for it." "Yes," he said, "that. But then," she said, "I got up and made breakfast for 2 children who needed it, and I went on making it, and eventually the ground came back." He looked at her. "You are remarkably wise for a woman who claims she is just managing." "I am just managing," she said. "The wisdom comes from the managing." He smiled at her then, the real smile, fully there, not a ghost of one, the kind that changed his whole face and made him look younger and less weathered, and like the man he might have been if life had been gentler with him. She held it in her memory like she would hold a lamp in a dark place. He proposed in August. He did it on a Tuesday evening, which was not the most romantic of days, and he did it with the same directness he brought to everything, which she found entirely appropriate. He had come to supper, and the children had gone to bed, and they were sitting on the porch in the warm night with the prairie spread out around them and the stars beginning to show, and he said, without preamble, "I want to marry you, Helen. I want to give Thomas and Clara a legal father, and I want to provide for this family properly, and I want to wake up in this house every morning and go to sleep in it every night." He paused. "And I am in love with you, which I should have said first." She turned to look at him. He was holding his hat in his hands and he was looking at her with complete undefended honesty, and she could see everything in his face, the hope and the tentativeness and the willingness to be refused gracefully if that was what she said. "You should have said that first," she agreed. "I know," he said. "I'm out of practice." She reached over and took the hat from his hands and set it on the porch rail between them. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." The stillness that moved across his face then, the release of something held tightly for a very long time, was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He reached out and took her hand, and she felt the careful grip of his fingers, and they sat together on the porch in the August night, and she felt something she had stopped believing she would feel again. She felt like the future was a real place, and they were already on the road toward it. The children were told the next morning over breakfast. Thomas's response was to push back his chair and fling himself bodily at Lionel with the force of a small cannonball, wrapping his arms around the man's neck with considerable enthusiasm. Lionel, to his credit, caught him, and the look on his face while he was being strangled by a gleeful 5-year-old was something that Helen privately considered the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Clara's response was different and more important, and Helen knew it. Clara sat very still for a moment after the announcement, and then she looked at Lionel, not at her mother, at Lionel, and said, "Will you live here, in our house?" "Yes," Lionel said, "if that is all right with you." Clara considered this for a long time. She considered it so long that Thomas had run out of enthusiasm for the strangling and gone to get a biscuit, and Helen had refilled the coffee pot, and still Clara was thinking. Then she said, "You prayed for us." It was not a question. She had known. All that time she had known. Lionel said, "Yes." Clara nodded slowly. "All right then," she said, and she picked up her biscuit and took a bite, and the thing was decided. Helen turned to the stove so that neither of them would see her face. The wedding was in September. Reverend Wells performed it in the small white church on a Saturday afternoon with a congregation that was smaller than some and warmer than most. Mrs. Carver was there, to her credit, and she had brought a pie. The mercantile owner and his wife, who had extended Helen credit through the lean early months, sat in the second pew. Several families from the farms and ranches surrounding the area filled the back rows. Helen wore a dress of pale blue wool that Clara had pressed with enormous care, and Thomas had inspected and declared satisfactory. She carried a small bunch of late summer wildflowers that Lionel had left on the porch that morning without a note, which was so precisely him that she had stood at the kitchen door laughing and crying in equal measure. Lionel stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned, a dark coat and a proper white shirt, and his hair actually combed, which she found privately very touching. And when she came down the aisle with Clara on one side and Thomas on the other, he looked at her with that direct gray-green gaze, and she walked toward it like walking toward a fire in the cold. When Reverend Wells asked the binding questions, Lionel answered with a steadiness that she felt in her bones. She answered with the same. She had been afraid, a little, that she might cry during it, which seemed to her an insufficient and inadequate response to the magnitude of the moment, but she did not cry. She was clear-eyed and certain, and when Lionel's hands closed over hers to place the ring, a simple gold band from the Caldwell jeweler, because that was what he could afford and he had told her so plainly, she felt the warmth of those hands and thought, there it is. There is the rest of my life. Thomas, standing beside her, had leaned against her hip with his eyes wide and solemn, watching everything. Clara had held Helen's flowers and watched her mother's face. After the ceremony in the churchyard, Sheriff Alderman had shaken Lionel's hand and said, "Congratulations, Blackwell. It suits you." And Lionel had nodded and said nothing, but he had been looking at Helen across the yard where she was accepting congratulations from Mrs. Carver, and the look on his face was something that Alderman apparently found instructive, because the sheriff had nodded and moved on without further comment. They drove home in the late afternoon light, the four of them in the wagon, Thomas asleep across Helen's lap before they had gone a mile. The land was gold and amber in the September light, the creek cottonwoods beginning to turn, the grass cured off to a pale straw color that hummed in the light breeze. Lionel drove. Helen sat beside him. Clara was in the wagon bed behind them reading, because Clara would read in any conditions, which was a trait Helen admired and had encouraged from the beginning. Helen looked at the land, her land, their land now. "Are you happy?" Lionel said quietly, not looking at her. "Remarkably so," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her then briefly from under the brim of his hat, and what was in his face was not complicated at all. "Yes," he said, "more than I thought I had the right to be." She took his arm in both of hers and rested her head against his shoulder, and he let her, and they drove through the golden September afternoon toward home, and it was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything. Life on the South Fork settled into a rhythm that was hard and good in equal measure. The days were long and the work was constant, but it was work that had a shape to it now, a shared shape. Lionel moved the last of his cattle from the south pasture. He sold the south pasture grazing rights to a neighboring rancher named Beaumont to fund the improvements the homestead needed, and put his remaining herd on the west pasture, where his own land ran adjacent to theirs. Helen's kitchen garden came back better than ever in the spring of 1879, the heifer disaster a distant memory. She put in twice the beans and added a row of squash and a large plot of sunflowers because she liked them, which Lionel pointed out were not edible, to which she replied that not everything was about eating, and he had accepted this with a nod that she recognized as his way of conceding a point. The money situation was tight but not impossible. Between Lionel's cattle operation and the grazing lease and Helen's kitchen garden and the eggs from the 12 chickens she had acquired by Christmas, they managed. There were months when managed meant exactly and no more, but there were also months when managed meant enough to put a little aside, and the little pile in the tin box under the kitchen floorboard grew slowly. Thomas started school in the fall of 1879, which was the source of considerable pride and considerable opinion on his part. He came home every afternoon full of news and argument and philosophical inquiry that required Lionel's sustained attention, which Lionel gave, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, answering questions about the nature of rivers and the reasons for weather and whether dinosaur bones were in Kansas, which they were. Lionel knew, because he had found one himself on the Cimarron, and this information had sent Thomas into a state of excitement so intense he could not sleep for 2 nights. Clara, at 9 by the spring of 1879, was reading at a level that exceeded her class and had begun borrowing books from Reverend Wells, who had a collection of particular quality. She had also developed a friendship with the blacksmith's daughter, a sharp-edged girl named Nora who matched Clara's quiet seriousness with a complimentary boldness, and the two of them together were a combination that Helen found both reassuring and faintly alarming. Lionel had become, quietly and without particular ceremony, Clara's father in every way that mattered. He helped her with her schoolwork, which required increasingly advanced engagement as her capabilities grew. He listened to her opinions, which were many and carefully formed. When she was ill in January of 1879 with a fever that lasted 4 days, he had barely left the house, splitting his time between the barn work that had to be done and checking on her in the back room with a regularity and a pale-faced worry that told Helen everything she needed to know about the depth of what he felt. Clara, from her sickbed on the 3rd day, had asked him to read to her, and he had read to her for 2 hours from the book of Psalms that sat on the table beside her. Not because she had asked for the Psalms specifically, she had just asked for something read out loud, but it was what he reached for, and when Helen had come in to spell him and he had stepped outside, she had seen Clara's face, and it was the face of a child who was, completely and permanently, his. On a cold February evening in 1879, after the children were asleep and the wind was up outside and the house was warm from the fire, Helen told Lionel that there was going to be another child. He went very still. She watched him carefully, the way she watched him whenever she was saying something that might reach the deep places. "In the autumn," she said. "August or September, I think." He looked at the fire for a long time. She let him look. Then he looked at her and his face was, she had to look again to be sure she was reading it correctly. His face was full of a careful, enormous joy, the kind of joy that knows its own fragility and holds itself gently because of it. "Helen," he said. She went to him and he held her tightly and she felt him breathe against her hair. "I am all right," she said. "I am strong. We are going to be fine." "Yes," he said. It was as much a decision as an agreement. She looked up at him. "Are you happy about it?" He looked down at her with those gray-green eyes, and in them was everything he had lost and everything he had found, and he said, "I am terrified and I am more happy than I can tell you, and I believe that is correct." She laughed and pressed her face against his chest, and he held her close in the firelight, and outside the Kansas wind went around the house and found no way in. The children were told in the spring, when the growth was evident, and explaining it could no longer be theoretical. Thomas received the news with a brief, fervent wish for a brother, and then returned to his current project, which was attempting to build a dam in the creek, with the assistance of approximately zero engineering knowledge and unlimited determination. Clara had asked several careful, practical questions about the timeline and sleeping arrangements, and whether they would need to add on to the house, which was a question so cogent that both her parents had laughed, and then confirmed that yes, they had been discussing exactly that. Lionel did add on to the house that spring, with the help of Beaumont's son and one of the hands from the next farm over, adding a room to the back. Helen spent 6 days cooking meals for the construction crew and felt that this was a fair division of labor, and told Lionel so, and he agreed with his characteristic nod, which had come to feel, she reflected, like a form of endearment. The Hollies situation had not recurred after Sheriff Alderman's intervention, but it had not entirely concluded either. Cade Hollies was the kind of man who held grudges and expressed them sideways, in small provocations. His cattle drifted occasionally. His fence was slow to mend on the shared side. And once, in the winter of 1878, One of his hands had been openly rude to Helen in the mercantile in a way that had made the room go quiet. Lionel had not been there that day. Helen had handled it herself with a look that the hand had found discouraging, and she had come home and told Lionel about it over supper. He had listened. His jaw had gone tight the way it did. "I handled it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "I do not need you to go speak to Cade Hollies about it," she said. "I know," he said, and then after a pause, "I would like to, though." "I know you would," she said. "Let it go. It is not worth the cost of escalation." He looked at her. "You are the most sensible person I have ever met," he said, and it was said with pure conviction. "I have had considerable practice at it," she said. He did not go to speak to Cade Hollies. The situation remained what it was: low-level and unpleasant, and below the threshold of real trouble. The Kansas frontier in 1879 had 100 such situations on every side, and Helen had long since calibrated her energy to the things that warranted it. She was aware, too, of the larger world that surrounded them. She had read enough and seen enough to understand that the land she and Lionel were building a life on had not always been empty, that the Comanche and Kiowa people who had ridden these plains for generations had been pushed from them by force and treaty, and that the treaties had not always been honored, and that the frontier expansion that had brought her here had come at a cost paid by others. She did not speak of it to Thomas and Clara as a finished story, as if justice had been done. She spoke of it as a complicated and unresolved truth, which was what it was, and Lionel, when she did, listened and agreed in his quiet way, because he had been a scout and he had seen it up close, and he carried the weight of what he had witnessed. The world was not simple. Their life on the South Fork was not removed from that complexity. But it was also, genuinely and without apology, good, and she had learned, through the process of grief and reconstruction, that the presence of injustice in the world did not mean you were not allowed to live as well and truly and lovingly as you could within your own reach. The baby was born on a September morning in 1879. Helen had sent Thomas to stay with Mrs. Beaumont the day before, because she could feel the time was near and she wanted him out of the house. Clara had stayed, because Clara at 9 was the kind of steady presence that helped rather than hindered, and because she had asked to stay with a quiet directness that Helen had not been able to refuse. The midwife from town, Mrs. Lott, arrived in the early morning, and Lionel kept his vigil outside with the controlled, white-knuckled patience of a man who has rehearsed this fear and knows he must hold still through it regardless. He had checked on Helen twice before Mrs. Lott had turned him out, and she had seen the fear in his face and had held his hand and said, "I am going to be fine," and she had put every possible conviction behind it. She was fine. The baby arrived at mid-morning, red and outraged and thoroughly present in the world, and when Mrs. Lott opened the bedroom door and told Lionel Blackwell that he had a son, the expression on his face was one that Clara, who was standing beside him in the hall, described to her mother later as, like he had been given something he never expected to be given. They named him James Daniel Blackwell, James because Lionel had had a younger brother named James who had died of consumption before the war, and Daniel because Daniel Ramsey's land had brought them together. Lionel held the baby that first afternoon with the careful, large-handed tentativeness of a man who has not done this before and knows the preciousness of what he is holding. He sat in the chair beside Helen's bed and looked down at the face of his son, and whatever was on his own face was something so private and so deep that Helen, watching from the pillow, felt it as a physical thing in her own chest. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, as if introductions were important. James Daniel Blackwell regarded his father with the slightly unfocused gaze of the newly arrived, and waved one small fist. Thomas, when he was brought back from Mrs. Beaumont's, regarded the baby with a brother's complex ambivalence, interest, and slight suspicion, and the beginning of a possessive pride that would expand as the years went. He had wanted a brother, and he had gotten one, But the brother was considerably smaller and more demanding than he had anticipated, and he adjusted his expectations accordingly. Clara held James that first evening with the careful competence of a girl who had always been more adult than her years, and the expression on her face was the softest thing Helen had ever seen on it. Lionel, from across the room, watched his wife and his 3 children in the lamplight with the expression of a man who has been given more than he ever intended to ask for, and is not yet sure he deserves it. He had said exactly that later when the children were asleep and Helen was resting and the house was quiet, the 2 of them alone in the lamplight. "I keep waiting," he said, "for it to feel less than it looks." "Does it?" she asked. "No," he said. "It keeps being exactly as much as it looks." "Then perhaps," she said, "it is exactly what it is." He looked at her from across the room. This man she had been warned against. This man who had fixed her porch step without being asked and prayed over her children in the dark, and learned to laugh again after years of silence, and answered every one of Thomas's impossible questions with patient gravity. And she thought of all the things people had told her about him before she knew him, and she felt a fondness for those well-meaning, ill-informed people that was almost affectionate. Because they had been wrong in the most wonderful way. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was a hard one on the plains. The cold came early and stayed late, and there were 3 weeks in January when the temperature dropped low enough to freeze the creek solid, and the cattle had to be brought into the lower pasture closer to the barn. Lionel and Helen worked side by side through those weeks in the way they had worked at everything, distributing the labor according to sense, not tradition, which meant she drove the feed wagon and he broke the ice in the water troughs, and they both mucked stalls and checked the animals twice a day without anyone keeping score. Thomas, who was 6 and in school and considered himself essentially a grown hand on the operation, helped in the ways he actually could and invented contributions for himself in the ways he could not. And Lionel let the invented contributions stand with the same seriousness he applied to the real ones, which Thomas found entirely satisfactory. Clara turned 10 in the winter and had asked for, of all things, a book on geometry, which Reverend Wells had ordered from Wichita for her as a birthday gift, and which she read in 2 days and came to Lionel with questions about that he answered as best he could, and then admitted the limits of his own knowledge, which she apparently found endearing because she had smiled at him in the full, warm way she reserved for very few people. James thrived through the winter with the constitutional stubbornness of a prairie-born child. He was a large, cheerful, determined baby who had developed by December an opinion about mealtimes that he expressed with considerable volume, and a laugh that entered the room before the rest of him. In February of 1880, Lionel came home from town with a crate from the general store and put it on the kitchen table and opened it, and it contained 6 books, including a proper reader for Thomas, and a volume of history for Clara and 2 novels he had asked the store to order specifically, because he had seen Helen's face when she talked about the books she had read in St. Louis, and he had made a list without telling her. She had opened the crate and gone through it item by item, and when she got to the novels she had gone very quiet and then had looked up at him. "Lionel," she said. "You mentioned them last fall," he said. "I did not forget." She had put her hands over her face for a moment and then taken them away and said, in the most matter-of-fact voice she could manage, "You are a remarkable man, Lionel Blackwell." He had looked at the floor and then at the window and then back at her, and then he had said, in a voice that was as matter-of-fact as hers, "I am a man who is trying to be worthy of what he has." And she had crossed the kitchen and kissed him, with Thomas watching from the doorway and saying, with the profound sincerity of a 6-year-old's commentary on adult affection. Spring came back the way it always did on the Kansas plains, sudden and decisive, and the land woke up into color and movement and the smell of warm earth and new grass. Helen put in the kitchen garden again, double the beans, triple the sunflowers, and a row of hollyhocks along the house wall because she had decided beauty was a legitimate farm product. The Hollies' situation resolved itself in the spring of 1880 in the way that such situations sometimes do, not dramatically but conclusively. Cade Hollies had run himself into debt the previous fall and sold his land in the winter to a family named Garrett from Ohio who turned out to be decent, hard-working people with 3 daughters and a very large number of opinions about crop rotation, and who became, within a season, good neighbors. The trespass issue simply stopped. The cut fence wire and the drifted cattle and the low-level hostility disappeared with the Hollies family's departure, and Helen had noted this with a relief that was quiet and genuine and moved on. By the summer of 1880, the South Fork homestead was, if not prosperous, then genuinely stable and growing toward it. Lionel's cattle operation had been carefully managed through 2 years of varying market prices to a point of moderate reliability. Helen's garden produced more than they needed, and she had begun selling the surplus at the Saturday market in Caldwell, which she found she enjoyed enormously. The talk, the transaction, the sense of being part of the larger fabric of the town. She had become, in 2 years, a known and respected figure in Caldwell, the widow who had come out with 2 children and made the Ramsey property into something real, who had married Blackwell and apparently softened him in the process, though those who actually knew either of them understood that softened was not the right word, that what had happened was more like 2 hard things finding a way to fit together and become, in the fitting, something stronger. Lionel attended church every Sunday. He did not make a show of it, did not announce his return to faith in any dramatic way. He simply came and sat in the pew and listened, and occasionally, in conversation with Reverend Wells after services, said things that indicated he was thinking carefully about large questions. Reverend Wells had told Helen once that Lionel Blackwell was one of the most genuinely engaged members of his congregation, and she had smiled and said she was not surprised. Thomas, at 7, had become Lionel's shadow in the way that 7-year-olds become devoted to the specific adults they have chosen, following him through the barn work and the fence riding, and the cattle work with a puppyish devotion that Lionel bore with absolute patience, and returned, quietly, with the complete consistency of a man who will not fail a child who has trusted him. He had taught Thomas to ride properly that spring, a process involving considerable falls and no injuries worth mentioning, and a progression of pride in the boy's face that had gone from determined to triumphant over the course of 3 weeks. The day Thomas had ridden the full fence line on his own, Lionel had stood at the gate watching him come back at a canter with his hat flying and his face bright with joy, and Helen, who had been at the garden, had looked up and seen Lionel watching, and the look on his face had been something she could not look away from. It was the face of a father. It was such a simple thing and such a full one. She had gone back to her beans and planted with the warm conviction that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was not a feeling she had expected to have again, and was, for that reason, all the more precious. In the late summer of 1880, Helen discovered she was expecting again. She told Lionel on a warm August evening on the porch, the same porch steps where so much had happened between them, with the crickets loud in the grass and the first stars showing. He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to her with something on his face that had none of the fear that had lived in it 2 years ago. Not because the fear was gone entirely, because it would never be entirely gone, but because it was alongside other things now, crowded out by a confidence in their life together that had built itself over 2 years of getting up every morning and doing the work. "Are you well?" he said first. "Very well," she said. "Good," he said, and then, "Are you happy about it?" "Are you?" she returned. "I asked first," he said, which was such an un-Lionel thing to say that she laughed out loud, startling a dog 2 farms away. "Yes," she said when she had recovered. "I am very happy about it." "As am I," he said with a small, private smile that she had spent 2 years cataloging and still found remarkable every time. "Very much so." They sat together in the August warmth, and he took her hand in his, and they looked out at the land, their land, the land that had been a deed and a stranger and was now a life. And the night came down around them, soft and full of stars, and the crickets kept their steady song in the grass. The second child they had together was born in April of 1881. He was a boy. They named him Henry Lionel Blackwell, because Lionel had never considered putting his name on anything before this, and Helen had insisted, and he had agreed with a look on his face that she understood perfectly. Thomas received his second brother with considerably more assurance than his first, having by now established himself as the eldest and therefore the authority on most things, an authority that James, now a toddling 18 months, disputed vigorously and without language, and that Henry, newly arrived, was entirely uninterested in. Clara, at 11, held Henry in the afternoon after his birth with the same care she had given James and said, thoughtfully, "He looks like father." Lionel, who was sitting across the room, heard this and was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "You think so?" "Yes," Clara said, "around the eyes." Lionel looked at Helen. She looked back at him. She said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. Everything worth saying was already in the room. The years went forward with the good, productive quality of years lived fully and honestly. The homestead on the South Fork grew. A new chicken house in 1881, a second pasture fenced in 1882, the kitchen extended with a proper pantry in the fall of that year. Lionel sold 20 head of cattle in the summer of 1882 at a price that represented the best market he had seen, and the tin box under the kitchen floorboard became, for the first time in their life together, meaningfully full. He brought Helen to the bank himself that fall to open a proper savings account in both their names, and she stood beside him at the counter, the same counter where he had redirected a clerk 3 years earlier, and deposited the money with a satisfaction so deep it was almost physical. Thomas, at 9, was an effective hand on the farm and entirely aware of it. He had grown tall, lean, with his mother's color and something of Lionel's directness in his eyes. He had also developed, much to his parents' combined amusement, a very strong opinion about the proper management of cattle that he was not shy about expressing, which Lionel fielded with a patience that Helen privately considered superhuman. Clara, at 12, was at the top of her class in a way that had begun to make Reverend Wells suggest, cautiously, that there might be schooling options beyond Caldwell that she should consider. Helen and Lionel had discussed this carefully, seriously, treating it with the weight it deserved: Clara's future, Clara's abilities, Clara's choice. Clara herself had listened to the conversation, and then said that she wanted to become a teacher, which would require her to complete the advanced coursework offered at the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia, and that she understood this meant leaving home eventually, and that she intended to do it. She had looked at Lionel when she said it, this declaration, which was not so different in its deliberate certainty from the way Lionel himself spoke, and Lionel had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "That is the right choice for you," which was all she needed. James was a sturdy, cheerful 3-year-old who ran everywhere at full speed, and had developed the habit of ending up on Lionel's shoulders at some point in every day, where he sat with the serene confidence of a child who knows exactly where the safest high ground is. Henry was a placid, observant 1-year-old who watched everything around him with his father's gray-green eyes and gave the impression of cataloging it all for future use. Helen looked at her household one evening in the fall of 1882, the warm kitchen, the fire, Lionel at the table with Thomas doing arithmetic, Clara reading in the corner, James asleep on the floor by the dog that had arrived uninvited and never left, Henry in her arms heavy with sleep, and she felt the full weight of it. The fullness of it. She thought about a Tuesday morning in April of 1878, stepping off a stagecoach into the dust of Caldwell with 2 children and a deed and a determination that had felt in the harder moments more like stubbornness than genuine courage. She thought about all the warnings, Rough, godless, no patience, no church, not safe. She looked at the man at the table who was explaining long division to her son with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who has nowhere else to be and nowhere he would rather be, and she thought, they did not know him. They only saw the surface. They saw a man who had lost everything and sealed himself off, and they took that for the whole of him, and they were wrong, and she was glad every single day of her life that she had not listened. Later that night, after the children were all asleep and the house was quiet, she came to stand beside Lionel at the kitchen window where he was standing in the dark looking out at the prairie, the way he sometimes did in the evenings. She came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her without looking, because he knew her step and her presence the way you know the things that are central to your life. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Nothing specific," he said. "Just looking." She leaned into him. Outside, the Kansas night was immense and dark and full of stars, the creek cottonwoods a black shape against the sky, the grass moving in the slow, perpetual prairie wind. "I love this land," she said. "So do I," he said. He pulled her a little closer. "I love this life." She looked up at him. He looked down at her. "I thought," he said quietly, "for a long time after I thought I had forfeited the right to something like this. That it was not something I was permitted to have any more." He paused. "I am not sure when I stopped believing that." "I know when," she said. He looked at her. "Thomas walked up to you with a question about horses the first day I arrived," she said. "And you answered him." A pause. Then, very low, "Yes." "You have never not answered him," she said. "Not once. You have never made him feel like a burden or an interruption or like his questions were less than important. And you have done the same for Clara and the same for James, and you do it for Henry now, and you were doing it before we were married, before we were anything, because that is who you actually are, Lionel, underneath everything they said about you." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You see me more clearly than I see myself." "That is often how it works," she said. "With people who love each other." He turned and held her face in his hands, those large, careful hands, and looked at her with everything in his eyes, and then he kissed her with the thoroughness of a man who does not do anything halfway, and the prairie night went on around the house, wide and dark, and full of its own particular beauty. The years after 1882 folded one into the next with the good rhythm of a life properly lived. Clara grew into the serious, determined, brilliant young woman she had always promised to be, and in the fall of 1887, at 17, she left for the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia to pursue her teaching certificate. Helen and Lionel and all three boys drove her to the Caldwell station on a September morning, and Helen held herself together all the way through the farewell, and then Lionel put his arm around her on the platform as the train pulled away, and she put her face against his chest and allowed herself 1 minute of private weeping, and then she straightened up and said, "She is going to be extraordinary," and Lionel said, "She already is," and that was that. Clara wrote every week without fail, long letters full of careful observations about everything she was learning and everyone she was meeting. She came home for Christmas and the summers, and each time she came she was more Clara, more fully herself, more confident, more at ease with her own considerable intelligence. Thomas, at 14 in 1887, was already an invaluable part of the ranch operation, tall and hardworking and possessed of a natural understanding of cattle and land that Lionel recognized with a rancher's eye as genuine. He was also argumentative, opinionated, and completely certain of his own rightness on most subjects, which Lionel managed with the combination of firmness and humor that he had developed specifically for this purpose over the years. James was 9 and Henry 7, and the two of them together were a comprehensive management challenge that was the source of considerable entertainment for the rest of the family. James had inherited Thomas's boldness and Henry had inherited Lionel's quiet intensity, and the combination produced a series of plans and projects of increasingly ambitious scope that kept the household in a constant state of interested vigilance. In the spring of 1888, Helen discovered, with a surprise that was not complete but was still substantial, that she was expecting a fourth child. She was 39 years old, and she sat with this information for a morning before she told Lionel, turning it over and considering it from all angles. When she told him, he listened, and then he said, "Are you all right with it?" "Yes," she said, and she meant it fully. "Good," he said. "So am I." The child was born in October of 1888, and she was a girl. They named her Ada Ellen Blackwell, Ada for the woman Lionel had loved and lost, because Helen had been the one to suggest it, and Lionel had gone very still, and then said yes, with the voice of a man being given permission to honor a grief he had carried quietly for 15 years. Ellen for Helen's mother. They called her Ellie almost from the start because she was a bright, laughing creature who seemed to draw nicknames toward her by sheer force of personality. Lionel held his daughter on the first day with an expression that Helen had never seen on him before, something completely unguarded and warm, something that had no restraint in it at all. "Ada would have been glad," Helen said to him quietly. He looked at her. His eyes were bright. "Yes," he said, "she would have been." Thomas, at 15, regarded his baby sister with the complex mixture of a teenage boy confronted with an infant, mild embarrassment, secret adoration, and a fierce protectiveness that he would have died rather than admit to. James and Henry received her with the practical interest of boys who are always looking for allies. Clara came home from Emporia for Christmas of 1888, 5 months after Ellie's birth, and held her half-sister for an hour by the kitchen fire, and said to her parents with the composed gravity that was entirely her own, "You two continue to surprise me." And then she had looked down at Ellie and said, softly, "Hello, little one. We are going to be friends." Helen, from across the room, looked at Lionel. He looked back at her, 40 years old. A husband she had been warned against every way a woman could be warned, who had proven every warning wrong, not with a dramatic gesture but with 10 years of daily choice. The choice to fix the step, to bring the peaches, to kneel in the dark and pray for someone else's children, to listen without condescension and love without reservation and be present, fully and consistently present, for a family he had not expected to have. She thought about what she would have missed if she had listened. She thought about it and felt something so wide and warm that she had no word for it. "What are you smiling at?" He said. "Everything," she said. He looked around the room, at Clara with the baby, at Thomas pretending not to watch, at James and Henry arguing cheerfully about something that required no intervention, at the warm kitchen and the fire and the house that had been falling down around a deed when she arrived, and was now the fullest place she had ever lived in. He looked back at her. "Yes," he said, "everything." The years continued to be good ones. Clara received her teaching certificate in the spring of 1889, and took a position at a school in Wichita, and wrote home with the excitement of a woman who has found her work and knows it. Thomas, at 16, had become so fundamentally part of the ranch that the question of his future was not really a question. It was already answered in the daily evidence of his presence and his competence and his investment. He was Lionel's son in every way that the word son meant, and they both knew it. And it did not need to be said but was said anyway. One evening when the two of them were riding the fence line, and Thomas had made a decision about the South cattle that turned out to be exactly right, and Lionel had looked at him and said, "Your instincts are good. They have always been good." And Thomas had looked straight ahead and said, "I learned from watching you." And they had ridden in silence for a while after that, in the way of fathers and sons, who do not need many words to say the important things. James and Henry grew through the 1890s with the particular confidence of children who have known consistent love, children who understand themselves to be firmly and permanently held in the world. James, bold and outward-turning, became the talker, the connector, the one who knew everyone in Caldwell by name and was known back. Henry, quiet and deep-seeing, became the reader, the thinker, the one who would sit beside his father after supper and talk about things in long, careful sentences that Lionel followed with his full attention and engaged with his full mind. Ellie grew into the laughing, determined girl that her first days had promised, possessed of her mother's sense and her father's directness, and something entirely her own, a brightness that was neither one of them but was clearly both. She was 4 when she first climbed into Lionel's lap during family Bible reading and pulled the book toward her and said, "I want to read too." And Lionel had looked at Helen with something in his expression that was pure, uncomplicated delight, and had shifted the book so she could see the words. And from that evening on, Ellie sat beside him for every reading, following with her finger, learning the words one at a time with the fierce concentration of someone who has decided a thing and will accomplish it. Helen watched this. She watched it many times in many forms: Lionel and a child, or Lionel and 2 children, or Lionel and all of them together on a Sunday evening with the lamps lit and the house warm around them, and she never stopped feeling the depth of it, the rightness of it. The way a thing that was broken, the man he had been in 1878, sealed off and rough and praying to no one, or convinced he wasn't, had found its way back through the precise combination of grief and grace, and a woman who had walked onto his fence line with a deed and refused to be afraid. She was not the one who had saved him. She did not think of it that way. He had been finding his way back before she came: the porch step, the preserved peaches, the careful attention he paid to everything. These were not the habits of a godless man, but of a man who still knew what mattered and was choosing it even in the silence. She had just given him something to aim that knowing at, a family to aim it at, and he had aimed with everything he had every day for 10 years. That was the story. That was the whole of it. On a September evening in 1892, their 14th wedding anniversary, which they had been marking quietly each year with a supper together after the children were in bed, always with candles, because Helen had said once that candles were not an extravagance but a sacrament, and Lionel had accepted this taxonomy. They sat across from each other in the kitchen, and the candles were lit between them, and Thomas had taken the younger ones out to the barn to see a new calf. Because he was 20 now and understood these things without being asked, Lionel poured 2 cups of coffee and sat back and looked at Helen across the candlelight. 14 years, he said. Yes, she said. When you drove up to that fence in April of 1878, he said, with those 2 children and that deed, I thought you would last a season and go back. What changed your mind? She said. He was quiet for a moment. You fixed the fence splice correctly on the first try, he said. She laughed. He smiled, the real one, fully there, the one she had been collecting for 14 years and still found remarkable every time. That is what changed your mind, she said. The fence splice. And the way you looked when Thomas came and stood in front of me, he said, more quietly. You were terrified for him and you let him go anyway because he needed to not be afraid of everything, and you knew that, and you let him go. A pause. I knew then. She looked at him across the candlelight. I knew then too, she said. The porch step, the way you fixed it before I was even awake. He looked at his hands. She had learned his hands over 14 years, every scar and callus, every habit of motion. She knew them the way she knew the creek sound and the prairie wind, as things that were woven into the fabric of her daily world so completely that she could not have separated them from it. I am grateful, he said, not qualified, not complicated, just plain. So am I, she said, in the same way. Outside they could hear the voices of their children coming back from the barn, Thomas's low voice, James's rapid commentary, Henry's measured observations, and Ellie's high, clear laugh carrying through the September night air. Inside, the candles burned. The house was warm and solid around them. Helen Ramsey, who was Helen Blackwell now and had been for 14 years, looked at the man across the table from her, the rough man, the people had said, the godless man, and she thought about every morning she had gotten up in this house, and every evening she had gone to sleep in it, and everything in between, and she thought there was not a single day of it she would have given back. Not one. Lionel, she said. He looked up. Come here, she said. He came around the table and she took his hands in both of hers and held them, and the candlelight was between them and around them. And outside their children were coming home through the September dark, and the prairie went on for miles in every direction, and the stars were out, and the year was 1892, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. The children came in, loud and warm from the barn, full of news about the calf, and the kitchen opened to receive them, and Lionel's hand was in Helen's hand, and the candles burned on.